Elijah Rook. To some, he was a war hero. To others, a traitor. But to the ones who really knew him, the men who bled beside him in the mud, who heard his steady voice cutting through cannon fire, he was the only reason they ever made it back alive. Still, none of that mattered when the rope went around his neck. It started in the winter of 1863, in a stretch of Tennessee land too cold to breathe in and too muddy to stand still. The Union needed a miracle, and Elijah delivered it, over and over. He wasn't a man of fancy speeches or medals. He was a soldier through and through. Born in Kentucky, raised with calloused hands, and a father who believed in God, land, and discipline, in that order. But Elijah didn't fight for the North because he hated the South. He fought because he'd seen what slavery did to a man's soul. His uncle used to say, "A slave's chain rattles even in the master's sleep," and Elijah believed it. By the time he turned 29, Elijah had led his squad through 5 major skirmishes, 3 surprise ambushes, and 1 outright suicide mission that should have left them in a ditch with crows for company. Instead, they walked out, dragging their wounded with Confederate rifles and maps that helped win an entire region. The generals smiled. The newspapers called him the Steel Saint. Congress sent a letter. But behind all that glory, there was something festering. The Union brass didn't like how Elijah handled things. He took orders, yes, but he changed them in the field. He made calls that weren't sanctioned, releasing Confederate prisoners when it saved lives, saving black civilians instead of holding positions. Worse still, he refused to execute a captured rebel teen who turned out to be the son of a Southern senator. That was the first strike. Then came the letters. Private reports, unsigned but heavy with accusations, disobedience, insubordination, sympathizing with the enemy. No one had the spine to say it to his face, not until General Whitmore arrived. Whitmore was everything Elijah despised, a politician in uniform. His boots never touched mud, and his hands smelled more like ink than gunpowder. But he had power, and he wanted a clean war. No mercy, no rebels left breathing, no moral bray. Elijah, he didn't play that game, and that made him dangerous. It all came to a head after the Battle of Wayfield Crossing, a brutal 3-day slaughter where men froze overnight and bullets rained like cursed snow. Elijah's unit, Rook's Wrath, the boys called themselves, held the riverbank until their last bullet, using broken bayonets and bloodied fists. And when the smoke cleared, they'd taken more ground than expected. But Elijah had made a fatal choice. He let a Confederate medic go, a young woman who was treating both sides. She helped save 5 of his wounded men. When Whitmore found out, he flew into a rage. "You gave aid to the enemy?" the general shouted, spit flying like hot oil. "She saved my men," Elijah replied, calm as ever. "And what if she reports to her command? Then let her. I'd do it again." That was all it took. They charged him under Article 99, misconduct in the face of the enemy. A trial was held in a tent that still stank of blood. 3 officers sat in judgment. 2 owed their promotions to Whitmore. Elijah didn't plead, didn't beg, just looked each man in the eye and said, "I've got no regrets. I served my men. I served what's right." 2 days later, they dragged him out before dawn. His wrists were bound, but his spine was straight. His unit, what was left of them, were forced to watch. Not one dared look away. As the noose tightened, Elijah spoke his last words. Not to God, not to the generals, but to his men. Don't let them turn this into a lie. Then the trapdoor opened. And just like that, a hero was gone. Hanged not by the enemy, but by the very cause he gave everything for. The news didn't spread through trumpets or telegrams. It moved in whispers, carried on the breath of men too ashamed to speak loudly. They hanged Rook, they said, like it was some mistake, a bad dream someone forgot to wake from. At first, some soldiers didn't believe it. How could the Union execute the one man who actually gave a damn about his men? But then came the letter, sealed in black wax, official and cold. Corporal Amos Green received it 3 days after the hanging, his hand still blistered from Wayfield Crossing. He opened it slowly, half hoping it was a lie. But there it was, in neat cursive. By military order, Captain Elijah Rook has been executed for high misconduct against the Union Army. No mention of bravery, no mention of saving lives. Just a paragraph ending with, "Burial unnecessary." Amos stared at it like it was poison. He had fought under Rook for 2 years. Elijah taught him how to shoot straight, how to keep his hand steady while wrapping a wound, how to keep his soul from breaking in the face of death. And now, he was gone, treated like a traitor. Amos wasn't the only one burning. Private Henry Skins Collard, a wiry Tennessee farm boy with a mean laugh and a tattoo of a snake on his arm, snapped when he heard the news. Punched a lieutenant so hard he broke his own hand. They threw him in the stocks for a week. Sergeant Luther Grant, a black man from Georgia who had escaped slavery and fought like every bullet counted, refused to wear his uniform. "Ain't no honor in these colors if they killed the only decent man we had," he muttered, before disappearing into the woods one night, never to return. The camp changed. The air grew thicker. Whitmore strutted around like a rooster, proud of his cleaning of the ranks. He even promoted a spineless idiot named Wilkes to lead what was left of Rook's unit. But nobody respected Wilkes. The men called him Tin Hat behind his back, shiny, loud, and empty. He barked orders that no one followed, got 3 men killed trying to cross a river at night because he didn't listen to their warnings. When one of them drowned, he blamed it on cowardice, said it wouldn't have happened under a disciplined captain. That's when Amos decided something had to be done. He wasn't a talker, not really. But one night, under the canvas of a broken tent, he called the remaining members of Rook's Wrath together, just 5 of them now. They sat in silence for a long while, staring at the dirt, letting the crackling fire say what they couldn't. Finally, Amos said, "They killed him like a dog." No one spoke. "He saved our lives again and again, and they put a rope around his neck for it." Skins muttered, "Because he had a heart." Amos nodded. "We let that happen. We watched." "You sayin' we should have stopped it?" one asked. "No," Amos replied, eyes hard. "I'm saying we make sure they remember it, every damn one of them. Rook died for doing what was right, and they buried that like trash. We dig it back up." "How?" A pause. "Truth," Amos whispered. "We write down everything. What he did, what they did, what really happened at Wayfield Crossing. We send it to every family of every man who followed Rook. Every paper willing to listen. We speak his name." Skins chuckled bitterly. "You think words matter to these bastards?" Amos looked around, jaw clenched. They killed a man. They can't kill a story. That night, the 5 soldiers wrote until dawn. Not elegant, but honest. Blood-stained pages filled with raw memories. How Rook shielded civilians. How he carried the wounded. How he cursed Whitmore's orders when they made no sense. How he never let his men die for politics. By morning, the letters were wrapped, sealed, and sent out, through messengers, deserters, even paid travelers heading north. The truth had wings now. And somewhere, deep in Tennessee mud, Elijah Rook's grave, unmarked and unwanted, rested a little easier. But not everyone wanted that truth to spread. 2 days later, Whitmore's men began searching tents, ripping open bedrolls, burning letters, asking too many questions. Someone had talked. And the noose that hung Rook might not have swung for the last time. The crackdowns came fast, too fast. By the 3rd day after the letters were sent, it was clear that someone inside the camp had betrayed them. The guards didn't just search anymore, they interrogated. Quietly, brutally. Men were taken from their bunks in the dead of night, returned limping or not returned at all. Amos watched with clenched fists as a young drummer boy named Eli was dragged into the woods by 2 officers. He wasn't even part of Rook's wrath, but he'd been seen chatting with Skins the night before. An hour later, Eli came stumbling back alone, his lips split and his left eye swollen shut. He said nothing, just lay in his cot facing the wall. Amos knew time was running out. They had sent most of the letters, but not all. A few were hidden under a loose floorboard in the abandoned ration tent, their last shot at reaching the world outside. If those were found, everything would collapse. They'd be next. That night, Amos met with Skins behind the latrine trench, their usual spot now. "They're getting too close," Skins whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Amos nodded. "I think someone in Rook's wrath talked." Skins spat. "Ain't many of us left to choose from." "I know." The silence that followed said what neither wanted to. They had to find out who it was, before the general did. Meanwhile, Whitmore was becoming more theatrical in his control. He hosted daily assemblies, praising order and obedience, while warning of dangerous elements still poisoning the morale of our troops. He never said Rook's name, never once, as if erasing a man from memory could make him disappear. But Amos and the others weren't done remembering. 2 days later, while pretending to repair a fence, Amos overheard something that chilled his blood. Lieutenant Wilkes, that fool in the tin hat, was speaking with one of Whitmore's aides just out of sight. "We've narrowed it down to the black sergeant, the farm boy, and Green," the aide said, listing off Luther, Skins, and Amos. "Good," Wilkes muttered. "I want them made examples of." Amos didn't wait to hear more. He returned to camp, breathing hard. Luther had vanished weeks ago, maybe dead by now. Skins was hanging on by a thread. And him? He was next. But the truth was still hidden, those last letters under the floorboard. They had to go, now. That night, under a moonless sky, Amos snuck to the ration tent. The boards creaked like screams in the silence, but he worked fast. Pulled up the plank, stuffed the last bundle of letters into his shirt, and moved. He'd made it halfway back when the voice stopped him. "You're carrying ghosts, son." Amos froze. General Whitmore stepped out from the shadows like a snake, calm, smiling. 2 soldiers flanked him, rifles aimed. "I wondered who'd be foolish enough to keep that man's name alive," he said, nodding toward Amos's chest. Amos swallowed, then straightened. "He saved us, that's the truth." Whitmore's smile faded. "He disobeyed orders, that's treason." "No, sir," Amos said. "That was conscience." The general stepped closer. "You think you're a martyr, boy? You're a nobody, a footnote." Amos looked him dead in the eyes. "Then you better make sure I stay one." Whitmore didn't reply. Instead, he raised a hand, and everything went dark. When Amos woke, his hands were bound, face bruised, and his mouth tasted blood. He was in a holding cell just outside the main camp, with nothing but dirt and iron for company. And no letters. They'd taken everything. But not before one small thing had slipped through. Unnoticed, forgotten. A copy. 1 page. Folded inside Amos's boot. He felt it pressed against his ankle like a heartbeat. A single piece of Elijah Rook's story. And now, he'd need a miracle to get it out. The cell was made of stone and rot. Damp walls closed in tight, as if the prison itself wanted Amos to disappear. He sat in the corner, wrists raw from the rope, head pounding from the blow that brought him here. Outside, footsteps came and went, voices murmured, some laughed, mostly guards, mostly Kroll. Time passed slowly. Minutes felt like hours. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but fear sat heavier. Amos kept thinking about that one folded page in his boot, the only piece of truth that hadn't been burned or buried. It was Rook's final field report, the one he'd written after Wayfield Crossing. Not the official one, but the real one, honest and handwritten. He'd given it to Amos privately and said, "Keep this safe. If they ever hang me, let the words live longer than I do." Amos had hidden it ever since. But now he was caged like a dog and didn't know how long he had before Whitmore came to finish what he started. He wasn't alone for long. By dusk, they threw someone else into the cell beside him, Skins, bloody, limping, but alive. He hit the floor hard and groaned, then looked up, one eye nearly swollen shut. "Damn," he said, "didn't think I'd be seeing yo' ugly face in here." Amos managed a weak smile. "You talked?" Skins scoffed. "Hell no, they tried. Got a fist for it, too. Think I broke my knuckles on some fancy officer's nose." Despite the pain, they laughed. Briefly. Then silence. "I still got the page," Amos said quietly. Skins blinked. "You serious?" "Boot, inside lining." Skins gave a low whistle. "Then we ain't dead yet." They both sat back against the cold wall, sharing the stillness. For a while, nothing was said. The air between them heavy with thoughts of Rook, of the others, of the noose waiting just outside. Later that night, footsteps echoed again, this time slower, heavier. The cell door opened. Whitmore entered. He wasn't smiling. "Corporal Green," he said, "and Private Collard. I'd hoped we wouldn't get here, but here we are." He stepped forward, hands behind his back, staring like he was examining livestock. "You've caused me quite a bit of trouble. Do you have any idea how hard it is to keep a war righteous, to keep morale high? Men like Rook, men like you ruin that balance." Skins spat at his boots. "You mean truth ruins your lies." Whitmore didn't flinch. He turned to Amos. "Last chance. Tell me who helped you distribute those letters. Names, locations, routes, or I'll make your death something the devil himself wouldn't watch." Amos said nothing, just stared. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped. "Hang them both at sunrise," he told the guards behind him. As he turned to leave, he paused. "You think that page in your boot matters?" he said softly, not looking back. "You think the truth wins wars?" Then he walked out. The door slammed shut. Skins exhaled. Damn, he knows about the page. Amos swallowed. "Yeah, we gotta get it out." But how? That's when they heard a voice, soft, from the shadows behind the stone wall. "You still got it?" It was Sergeant Luther Grant, alive. Hidden in a narrow maintenance shaft, barely big enough to breathe in, he'd slipped into the cells through tunnels he'd been digging for weeks. "I've been watching," Luther said, "waiting. Figured they'd toss you two in eventually." Skins blinked. "You're real?" "Real enough to break you out," Luther said, sliding a small blade through the wall's crack. "But I ain't doing it for revenge. I'm doing it for Elijah." Amos fumbled to pull the paper from his boot and handed it to Luther, trembling. "Get it to someone who'll speak loud enough." Luther nodded once. "Get ready," he whispered. "Sunrise is in a few hours, and so is your second chance." Then he was gone. But not before they saw the torchlight in his hand disappear into the dark. The hours before dawn stretched like wire across the skin, tight, tense, deadly. Amos and Skins sat with their backs to the cold wall, silent now, not because there was nothing to say, but because the weight of everything felt too heavy to speak through. Outside the cell, the camp was still. Not the kind of stillness that meant peace, but the kind that meant something bad was coming. You could hear it in the wind, like it knew what sunrise would bring. They didn't sleep, couldn't. Not when the last thing they might see was a rope and a crowd forced to watch. At some point, Amos reached down and touched the space where the folded page had been inside his boot. Gone now, gone to someone brave enough to carry it. If Luther didn't make it, all of this, all Rook's truth, would disappear like smoke in the wind. And still, he didn't regret it. Just before the sky started to glow gray, the door opened again. 2 guards stepped in, both holding rifles like they were bored of the job. One kicked at Skins. Up, let's go. Skins spat at his feet. Tell the rope it can wait, I ain't dressed yet. The guard slammed his rifle butt into Skins' ribs. He groaned, but didn't fall. They tied their hands, led them out under a sky just starting to open its eyes. No words were spoken, no ceremony, just a walk to the edge of the camp where a gallows stood like a warning. Amos looked around. Soldiers had gathered, tired, bitter faces. Some he recognized, some he didn't. Most didn't make eye contact. They'd seen a hanging before. But this one felt different. Rook's shadow still hung over the camp, and now 2 more of his men were about to follow him. Whitmore stood near the gallows with his hands behind his back, that same dead-eyed calm on his face. "Any final words?" he asked, pretending to care. Amos looked out at the men. "I ain't afraid to die," he said, voice steady. "But I hope to God someone here still remembers what justice looks like. Because this," he nodded at the noose, "ain't it." Skins just grinned. "If you're gonna kill me, get it over with. You ain't worth my last words." Whitmore raised a hand. The hangman stepped forward, placed the nooses around their necks. Amos felt the rope tighten. His heart raced, not from fear, but from fury. This wasn't justice. This was erasure. He looked up at the pale sky and thought of Elijah Rook. He wondered if this was what he felt too. And then, a shout. It came from the northern path. "Wait!" All heads turned. A soldier on horseback came galloping through the gates, holding a dirty brown satchel in one hand, yelling loud enough to split the air. His coat was Union, but he wore no rank. Mud-splattered, eyes wild. Guards moved to stop him, but the man threw the satchel down at Whitmore's feet. "From Senator Caldwell himself," he barked, "delivered by hand, straight from Washington." Whitmore flinched. That name carried weight. Caldwell was no friend to Whitmore. He'd been on Rook's side once, back when Rook was still a rising name. The general opened the bag slowly. Inside were copies of the letters, dozens of them. Not just Rook's field report, but testimonies, signatures, statements from families of fallen men. Some were scrawled by hand, others freshly inked, but all of them said the same thing. Rook was no traitor. He was a hero. More than that, the letters accused Whitmore of fabricating charges, of suppressing truth, of orchestrating Rook's death to silence disobedience. A murmur rippled through the soldiers. Whitmore's face went white. This is forged," he snapped, crumpling a page. The messenger stepped closer. "Senator Caldwell sent word. If you hang another man tied to Rook's name, he'll see you court-martialed before sundown." The tension was like lightning. Skins chuckled through the noose. "Guess that rope's gotta wait after all." Whitmore's lips trembled, rage barely held back. But he couldn't touch them now, not in front of all these eyes, not with the senator's name hanging heavier than the noose. "Take 'em down," he barked, voice like gravel. The hangman hesitated. "I said take 'em down." Amos stumbled forward as the rope loosened, lungs sucking in air like he'd just been born again. Skins coughed and laughed at the same time. As they were untied, Amos locked eyes with Whitmore. "You can bury a man," he said quietly, "but not the truth." The general didn't respond. He couldn't. And as Amos and Skins walked away, bruised but free, they didn't just carry Rook's name. They carried his legacy. And now, the whole world. They didn't leave camp that same day. Amos and Skins stayed long enough to see the shift. Men who wouldn't speak Rook's name before now whispered it with reverence. Some even saluted them as they passed, not because of rank, but because of what they'd done. Because they stood when the world wanted them to kneel. Whitmore didn't leave his tent for 3 days. When he did, he walked with his head low and his shoulders tighter. He still barked orders, but fewer men snapped to attention. The gallows stayed empty. The noose swayed in the breeze, abandoned like the lies it was meant to serve. But Amos knew this wasn't over. The war was still raging outside those fences. Men were still dying. And the truth, Rook's truth, had made enemies in high places. Senator Caldwell had spared them the rope, but only just. That protection wouldn't last forever, especially once Whitmore recovered his pride and started spinning stories again. The man wouldn't stop, not unless someone made him. So Amos, Skins, and Luther, who had finally stepped out of the shadows after the escape, gathered under cover of night. They sat in the same abandoned ration tent where the letters had once been hidden, now surrounded by the men who still believed in Rook's cause. Most of them weren't soldiers anymore in their hearts. They were something else now. Witnesses, messengers, carriers of a flame they refused to let die. "There's more," Luther said, spreading a hand over the table. From his coat, he pulled another bundle. More reports, smuggled testimonies from deserters, freed slaves, even a Confederate soldier who defected after witnessing Rook's mercy during a skirmish. The man had written, "If that's what the North hangs, then maybe I backed the wrong flag." These need to go north, Amos said. Past generals, past politics, straight to the people. Skins raised an eyebrow. "And how you plan on doing that? We march up to Washington with a paper stack and hope they let us in?" "No," Amos said. "We spread it like fire, everywhere. Towns, churches, taverns, rail stops, every hand that'll carry it. We don't ask the Union to clear Rook's name. We make it impossible for them to ignore it." Luther nodded slowly. "Truth by force. I like that." They spent the next days organizing routes, splitting the pages, assigning couriers, bribing sympathetic postal riders. A few were caught and jailed. One was shot. But most got through. Soon, stories of Elijah Rook, the hero hanged by his own army, began appearing in places the generals couldn't reach. Barbershops, prayer halls, back rooms of general stores, and farmhouses lit by candlelight. The soldiers who once feared punishment now whispered his name with pride. Even in Confederate territory, the name spread. Some said Rook had saved black children from a burning barn. Others said he'd buried his own men with his bare hands after Wayfield Crossing. One tale claimed he refused to shoot a surrendering rebel even when Whitmore demanded it. Maybe all of it was true. Maybe just some. But none of it could be erased now. Then came the letter, hand-delivered to Amos under moonlight, sealed with red wax. It bore the stamp of the War Department. Inside, the message was brief but sharp. "You are hereby ordered to report to Washington for questioning regarding the dissemination of unauthorized military correspondence. Refusal to comply will be treated as desertion. Secretary Stanton." Skins read it and cursed. They finally woke up. Amos folded the letter. "They want a meeting?" he said. "Fine, let's give 'em one." "You mean go?" Luther asked, squinting. "I mean walk right into the lion's den with a torch." He looked at the others, voice low but firm. "We finish what Rook started. Not just truth, justice." Skins smiled. "Damn, you really are his man." And so they prepared to head east, into the heart of the beast. Not to beg, but to burn the lies down in front of the men who built them. Washington was colder than Amos remembered. Not the air, though the February chill scraped at their skin like a dull knife, but the atmosphere. Every street corner buzzed with whispers of the war, but not one voice mentioned Elijah Rook. The Capitol was polished stone and tight collars, filled with men who commanded bloodshed from behind warm desks and velvet curtains. Amos, Skins, and Luther arrived looking like what they were, battle-worn, road-weary ghosts from the front. The guards at the War Department stared at them with suspicion, as if their very presence insulted the marble floors. But the letter they carried bore the seal. It got them in. Inside, they were led down long halls, past rows of portraits, generals, politicians, men with cold eyes and powdered wigs. None of them looked like Elijah Rook. None of them would have died for their men. The meeting room was stark, a long table, chairs that looked too clean. Waiting on the other side were 3 men. A pale Secretary Stanton, who barely blinked when they entered, a representative from the Military Tribunal Board, and a young officer whose name they didn't catch, but whose smug face made Amos want to break something. "You were told not to disseminate classified material," Stanton began flatly. "You defied that order." "No, sir," Amos replied. "I exposed a murder." Skins grunted in agreement. Luther stayed silent, eyes scanning the room like he expected someone to pull a gun at any moment. Stanton folded his hands. Captain Rook was tried under military law. The ruling was final. "The trial was a joke," Amos snapped. "Held in a tent, no legal counsel, no testimony allowed, and the evidence was written after the fact." The tribunal man leaned forward. "Watch your tone, Corporal." "No," Amos said, louder now. "I won't. You hanged a man who saved lives, who upheld more honor in one day than some of you will in a lifetime. And you did it because he wouldn't be your puppet." Stanton's eyes narrowed. "You speak like a man without fear." Amos met his gaze. "I've had a rope around my neck. I don't fear men who hide behind desks." The room fell cold, silent. Then Luther stood. He stepped forward and placed the worn, stained page, Rook's handwritten report, on the table, folded but intact. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "This is his voice," he said. "You hanged the man, but this speaks louder than any rope." Stanton didn't touch it, just stared. The tribunal man finally cleared his throat. "What exactly do you want?" "Justice," Amos said. "For whom?" "For Rook, for the men who died under his command, for every name buried under lies, so you could sell a clean war to the newspapers." They waited. The silence was long and bitter. Then Stanton finally spoke, carefully. "There will be no official reversal, no pardon, not now. The war is still ongoing. A scandal like this would cost you votes," Skins interrupted. Stanton didn't deny it. "But," he added, "a recognition of misconduct may be noted, quietly, in time, should the war end in our favor." Amos shook his head slowly. "No, that's not enough." "What would be enough?" Stanton asked, genuinely curious. Amos leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. "You don't bury this. You publish it, publicly, under government seal. You name Rook in the record, not as a traitor, not as a rebel, but as what he was, a hero. And you name Whitmore, too, the man who lied, framed him, and sent good men to their deaths for his ego." The tribunal man scoffed. "That will never happen." "Then we go to the press," Amos said. "We've got dozens of witnesses, civilians, even Southern deserters. You can lock us up if you want, but this story's already out there. You can't stop it now." Stanton studied them, then leaned back. For the first time, something in his face shifted, weariness, maybe even guilt. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. I'll see what I can do. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a threat either. Outside, the wind howled down the streets of Washington, and the three of them walked away from the building, silent, shoulders squared, hearts steady. They didn't know if justice would come tomorrow, next year, or never, but they had lit the fire. And somewhere, buried in unmarked soil, Elijah Rook could finally rest a little easier. Months passed like drifting smoke after a battle, slow, haunting, and never fully gone. By the time spring returned to the fields and cities of a bloodied America, the name Elijah Rook had begun to rise again, not whispered, not feared, but spoken aloud. Sometimes quietly, sometimes with pride, but never forgotten. Amos, Skins, and Luther didn't return to the front. They'd done their share of killing. Now they fought a different war, one fought with memory, paper, and truth. In towns across the North and even into the fringes of the South, the story of the hero who was hanged by his own side traveled like wildfire, not just through letters anymore, but in speeches, handbills, sermons, and folk songs sung in taverns. A teacher in Ohio started calling it Rook's Rebellion, not a rebellion of violence, but of conscience. And then came the impossible. A small column buried in the corner of the New York Herald. Re-examination of Captain Elijah Rook's case ordered by military tribunal. Amos read it twice, then folded the paper with shaking hands. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall that had tried to seal Elijah's memory behind it. And more cracks followed. Whitmore was quietly removed from command. No charges, no trial, just gone. Transferred to a distant garrison out west where politics could no longer protect him. No ceremony, no farewell. The army didn't say why, but everyone knew. Then, finally, in the winter of 1865, long after Rook had been lowered into that cold Tennessee mud, a letter arrived at Amos's doorstep. Official seal, neat script, from the War Department. The record of Captain Elijah Rook has been amended to reflect acts of distinguished service and battlefield gallantry. No conclusive evidence of misconduct remains on file. At the bottom, the signature of Stanton himself. No apology, no grand confession, just quiet correction. But in that small, dry admission lay a victory. Not for the generals, not for Washington, for Elijah, for every man who followed him. For truth. Later that year, they returned to the place where it all ended, Wayfield Crossing. The field was green again, wildflowers blooming where blood once soaked the soil. A crude wooden marker still stood where Rook had been buried, carved by a soldier who hadn't known how to spell all the words. Captain E. Rook died right. Amos brought something new that day, a stone, polished and graved with the words, Elijah Rook, soldier, leader, martyr of conscience, hanged for mercy, remembered for honor. He, Skins, and Luther stood before it in silence. No uniforms, no flags, just three men and the wind. After a while, Skins muttered, "You think he knows?" Amos looked up at the sky, the wide stretch of it where clouds drifted like old regrets. He knew before we ever did. They didn't stay long. They had places to be. Churches to speak at, families of soldiers to visit, boys who'd never seen the war but one day ask about it. Because if there was one thing Elijah Rook had taught them, it was this. A good man might die, but a true story never will. And so they carried it forward. Not in uniforms or parades, but in firelit rooms, on pages smuggled across borders, in songs sung by the next generation. The man they tried to erase had become the story they couldn't silence. And even death couldn't hang the truth forever. If you like my content and want to reach out to more, please like, share, and subscribe.